Danielle Battisti. She was unknown to me. She was one of the 3 or 4 Italian-American scholars in the whole world who I didn't know intimately. That doesn't reflect anything positive on me. It just reflects that I've been around for a while. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She specializes in immigration and ethnic history. She's working on a manuscript which has a title similar to her presentation today, so this is seminal information. She graduated from the University of Buffalo, and in her study of the Italian Americans and the politics of immigration reform in the period after World War II, there were a lot of Chicago Italian Americans who show up, and we always like to see that. So I'm pleased and proud to introduce Danielle Battisti.
Dominic and all others who organized this conference, and I want to beg your indulgence this morning. I had a baby 5 weeks ago, so this paper is brain.
Okay, I'm going to get it right now.
Great.
On December 15th, 1963, over 7,000 Italian Americans gathered at Chicago's McCormick Place to protest the nation's immigration policies and to champion instead what one speaker referred to as, quote, immigration laws compatible with man's dignity as a child of God. The rally was just one event in a long campaign that white ethnics, particularly Italian Americans, had been fighting since the end of World War II. Individuals and groups concerned with American immigration laws had been advocating for the abolition of the national origin system, which had governed American immigration policies on the basis of racial and ethnic quotas which were discriminatory since the 1920s. These immigration reform advocates were motivated by a variety of factors. For some Italian Americans, they finally saw their ethnic group achieve mainstream status in the United States in terms of jobs, housing, education levels, and other markers of inclusion. But the nation's immigration policies were one of the few remaining stigmas that were attached to Italian Americans. Those Italian Americans believed that quotas, which marked Italian immigrants as undesirable or unfit for citizenship in the United States, reflected poorly upon their own position in American society. For others, opening immigration opportunities to Italians was a way that they could help relieve population pressures in their homeland and therefore stave off communist appeals to Italians who were suffering from unemployment, housing shortages, and a declining quality of life at home during the Cold War. But for the majority of Italian Americans, their motivations hit much closer to home. Tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Italian Americans wanted to create openings for their family members and friends to join them in the United States. So herein they viewed the national origin system as not only racially and ethnically discriminatory, but inhumane in its separation of families as well. I don't have any pictures of the rally, so what I put up here is Italian Americans lobbying JFK earlier that year. These are members of ACHA, the American Committee for Italian Migration, and as Dr. Candeloro said, there's a very active chapter in Chicago. In the place of the national origin system, Italian American activists began to advocate for the adoption of more equitable immigration policies in the 1950s and 60s. They defined equitable in political, social, and religious terms. They argued that American immigration laws should be based on liberal ideas of political and social equality that they believed better reflected the American way at mid-century. Thus, immigration policy should not discriminate against any one racial, ethnic, or religious group. Secondly, the United States, as a Judeo-Christian nation and a world leader whose policies set examples for other nations, needed to embrace policies that were more humanitarian in nature. Policies that helped connect rather than divide, and policies that provided assistance for those most in need, particularly refugees and displaced persons. So as a result of all of these concerns, Italian-American immigration reformers, particularly those with strong religious identifications, advocated replacing the national origin system with laws that would govern on the basis of family unification instead. Family unification laws, they reasoned, would allow for the fair distribution of immigration visas to all persons regardless of their race, ethnicity, or religion. They would help unite peoples and families. And finally, they would help create a more Christian society and a humane world. So that's what I'm going to focus on in this paper. There was a strong Catholic presence at the Chicago rally that day in December. Italian-American Catholics, including priests and other church officials, lay Catholic organizations, and national Catholic charities played a significant role in helping to organize the rally and to garner turnout for it. The rally was organized by the American Committee for Italian Migration, which is secular but works with the National Catholic Resettlement Conference or Welfare Conference, so depending on who's running the show. Participants in these organizations, as well as church officials, were among the speakers that day that stressed how a Catholic worldview regarding migration rights should be applied to American immigration laws. And then finally, after weeks of publicizing this rally in religious groups, at ethnic clubs, other organizations, most of the people that attended that day gathered at one of 7 local churches in Chicago where they were then shuttled on charter buses to attend this rally. So in short, Chicago's Italian Catholics were instrumental in ensuring the success of this particular rally and more broadly in demonstrating to American lawmakers and the general public that they were a significant political force that demanded attention and that their worldview demanded attention. So the Catholic worldview that helped to shape the ideology of the immigration reform movement was part of the rally this day. So that's what I'd like to spend the rest of the paper talking about, mostly. I feel somewhat stupid explaining exul familia to some members of this audience, but I'm going to do it nonetheless. Italian-American Catholics based much of their now, the emergence of modern nation-states often put limits on man's access to those resources. So this became problematic. Secondly, in exul familia, the Pope explained that material resources on earth were available so that not only individuals could thrive, but families could flourish both temporally and spiritually. According to the Church, individuals have a right to family in order to experience the relationships God intended for them. Fatherhood and motherhood are holy expressions and duties. Familial love, obedience, and loyalty are Christian expressions, etc. Family life also helps promote a broader Christian morality within the community. So man's right of man to the right of man to migrate is also linked to the maintenance of his family life, and this is considered of utmost importance. And then finally, as a corollary to man's right to migrate, the Church argued that artificial barriers must not be put in place by nation-states to restrict man's migration rights. According to Catholic theology, societies and nation-states are formed with the end goal of preserving the common good. In this worldview, the state is not completely sovereign. The state is not an end to itself. It exists to promote the laws of God and to ensure the common good and the moral and material welfare of its members. So each nation is just one of many nations that makes up part of a holy family on earth. Therefore, nation-states should submit to a higher natural law working toward the good of humanity. In this worldview, states cease to derive legitimacy when they fail to promote God's laws or the common good. So when it comes to the right of man and families by extension to migrate, there are moral limitations on the state's ability to govern migration. According to the Pope in Exul Familia, states can only restrict the right of migration when it is in the interest of the common good. And this means when when states see fit to preserve their society's internal order, security, these are fair ways to restrict migration, or reasons to do so. But just from having political or economic protectionism is not a legitimate reason to restrict migration. So Catholic ideology provided a strong counter-argument to restrictionist immigration policies that were in place in the United States and elsewhere in the post-war period. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, the United States was one of several countries that was guilty of putting its own interest above human rights and natural or divine laws. Indeed, Pope Pius XII signaled out the United States in this regard. The Pope announced his position on migration on Christmas Day 1952, which was the very same day that the McCarran-Walter Immigration Act, which continued the national origin system, was set to take effect. The McCarran-Walter Act also gave very little opportunities for refugee relief or displaced persons migration in the United States. And in Exsul Familia, the Pope explicitly mentions the United States as a nation which put undue restrictions on the movement of refugees. It was this grievous injustice, and this was a grievous injustice considering that refugees are those that are perhaps some of the most in need of exercising the right to migrate. Also, the United States was in a powerful position in 1952. It had become a world leader by all rights, and it should have set an example in the world's family of nations of how you treat displaced persons, refugees, etc. So he reminded American bishops and a general audience by extension that the Creator made all things in the universe for the good of all, and that the sovereignty of the state, while it must be respected, must not be exaggerated or abused. He called this exaggerated nationalism when the United States and others abused its power in this way. So, the major points that I've just said, man has a God-given natural right to migrate in which states cannot invalidate those rights. The state does not have the absolute power to restrict this and other rights. And then finally, nation-states are part of a larger community, a larger family, and need to think about the common good of humanity. So, this was especially problematic when nation-states such as the United States that had lots of resources, lots of underdeveloped arable land, abundant materials were restricting migration. So many Italian-American Catholics shared the beliefs that were put forth in Exsul Familia and incorporated them into their campaigns for immigration reform in the post-war period. And here I just have an image of Cesare Donizin, who is a priest who's actively involved in Achim, greeting an arriving Italian family in 1956, just sort of showcasing how important family was to a lot of these immigration activists. So many of the people I'm talking about now incorporate this worldview into their campaigns. First and foremost, many Italian-American Catholics see family life, as I'm showing here, as very, very important in sort of the human experience. For them, no other relationship was more important. They saw membership in one's family as both a sacred right and responsibility. They saw family as the fulfillment of God's purpose for man on earth and an expression of his love. But the family played important secular functions also. For Catholics, more so than any other institution, the family shaped both the individual and the society's customs, values, and attitudes. So the family was one of the most important entities in the world that influenced not just sort of your personal day-to-day activities, but your larger communities, your national, and then your international relations. So these views contributed to Italian-American Catholics' appeals to urge lawmakers to adapt immigration laws that were based on policies of family unification. In their opinion, family unification laws would help preserve the sanctity of the family, reinforce the important role that family played in the community's moral development, and help to reunite families that had been in many cases harshly and unfairly separated for many years. To give you reunification laws would also provide a humanitarian and more equitable approach to governing American immigration policies. So Italian-American immigration reformers had long considered the national origin system discriminatory and racist. They frequently pointed out that such a system violated the American creed that all men are created equal, and this was from a secular nationalist point of view. But Italian-American Catholics added to their critique in the 1950s that the national origin system created a system where, quote, a person's worth and value is determined by his place of birth, and this measure of man's dignity is opposed to every religion that believes God is our Father and we are his children. So this comes from one of the speakers at that rally that I started out with that day. Many members of Catholic organizations saw themselves as part of a holy family, connected to all others regardless of citizenship, nationality, ethnicity, or race. Carolyn Sinelli Burns, she's an immigration activist in Achim in Michigan, and if you're looking for information on Italian-American Catholic women, go to this archive. This woman had OCD and was a very active Catholic and kept everything. So she talked about how she viewed herself. She said, I am not an American, not a North American, not a European. The Catholic woman is part of mankind. She is part of the mystical body. So herein, a Catholic worldview provided the foundation for a critique of American immigration laws from a religious and, therefore, I would argue, human rights perspective. Along with shaping the ideas behind the calls for legislative reform, a Catholic worldview also helped shape the ways in which Italian Americans provided aid to Italian immigrants in the post-war period. So, for example, individuals active in Achim and the National Catholic Resettlement Council partnered together in 1955 to create programs which would help Italian refugees resettle in the United States. These and other immigrant aid agencies provided newcomers with suitable housing, gainful employment, and material assistance with donations of household goods, clothing, and other items. So these are two families that resettled in the United States from Trieste, and you see some of the donations and the quality of life that they achieved from the help of these organizations in these images here. So among other things, Achim and the National Catholic Welfare Conference's assistance to refugees reflected Catholic beliefs in Christian charity, promoting stable homes, and nourishing the body as well as the soul. And I want to talk about a second way that organizations helped newcomers. So it didn't just sort of end with charitable aid. Achim and the National Catholic Resettlement Conference also developed formal programs which were designed to assist a number of refugee families at once and also carry out Catholic ideas at the same time. So one program that did these two things was called the York County Resettlement Project. I'm showing you the flyer on the left-hand side and an article about it on the right. This project aimed to transport and resettle southern Italian farm families to rural, underdeveloped areas of the American South. And there's some images here from the promotional literature. The idea of this program was to resettle Italian families, quote, without land or employment, unquote, at home to underdeveloped and uncultivated land in the American South. Not only did this project help families stay together at a time when many refugees could not afford to immigrate as a family unit, but organizers announced the project's goal was, quote, the spiritual and economic development of a landless people. And the tagline of the project read, quote, bringing people without land to land without people. So this really fulfills the ideas that you see in Ex Wo Familia. Juvenal Marcuzio, who's the executive director of Achim, commented of the project, quote, some nations are vastly overcrowded and their people hungry, while others are practically unpopulated and have a surplus of the necessities of life. So like I said, I think this really showcases how we put Catholic worldview into Catholic action in this period. And then I'll very, very briefly just say why I think just understanding the role of Catholic ideas and actions is important to understand the immigration reform movement itself. Firstly, historians have long overlooked the grassroots social activism of white ethnics in getting immigration reform passed in 1965. For a long time, we understood the abolition of the national origin system as either part of a series of civil rights reforms or a reflection of Cold War foreign policy maneuvering. We're only now starting to appreciate and understand the domestic concerns that prompted white ethnics like Italian Americans to call for immigration reform. So looking at an Italian American Catholic view and action helps us to understand why some of these people were getting involved in these movements. And then secondly, this paper shows how Catholic social thought contributed to the expansion of American liberalism, little L, classical liberalism in the post-war period. Humanitarian and egalitarian policies behind the right of man to migrate were powerful arguments which helped to convince lawmakers to establish policies that were more democratic and equitable for all groups of Americans. We usually associate the expansion of liberal democracy in the post-war United States with the civil rights movement, but I think it's important that we recognize that white ethnic campaigns for immigration reform were also part of that process, and we're operating in a parallel trajectory with civil rights reforms. So I've packed a lot in. I know